In our previous lecture, we considered the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany and its coming to power. In this lecture, we'd like to concentrate on the man behind the Nazi movement, who was key to its success and to its growing radicalism, Adolf Hitler. He came from beginnings that were obscure and unpromising, but would rise to become the leader of the German people, the Führer. This lecture profiles the man, the dictator, his distinctive characteristics as a political leader, and then considers the keys to his effectiveness. His long-range ideological goals were revealed in aggressive foreign policy, the launching of murderous programs, and ultimately World War II. We consider first of all Hitler's youth. He was born not in Germany, but in the Austrian Empire in 1889 to a middle-class family in Braunau am Inn. His father was a customs inspector, a bureaucrat of the empire. Hitler's youth was unremarkable and directionless. He was considered a slacker, a dreamer, who dropped out of high school to go off to the big city, to Vienna, in 1907 to become an artist, to seek fame. He was, however, rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts, which considered him a capable enough draftsman, but lacking that spark of artistic genius. And after this disappointment, Hitler slipped into a sort of netherworld of poverty in the Viennese capital. Now, we're accustomed to think of Vienna as a beautiful world capital of art, of cultivation. That it is. But it also had its ugly side at the start of the 20th century. Hitler claimed that this down-and-out period in the underworld of Vienna was decisive in his development, because he soaked up those many radical influences that were aswirl in the imperial capital. The anti-Semitism of the popular mayor, Karl Lueger, the racialist ideas that circulated on the fringes of its society, the extreme nationalism of the pan-German movement in the empire, which denounced the non-German nationalities ruled over by the Habsburgs, and the heroic artistic stances and mythological scenarios of Richard Wagner's operas. Later in life, Hitler would observe that no one could understand his political career without first understanding Wagner. Hitler subsisted in the flop houses, the men's hostels, the rescue missions of Vienna in poor circumstances. He was also fascinated by the scenes that unfolded in the streets of Vienna by people for whom he had no political sympathy, but whose talent for the organization of the masses he admired. He was fascinated by the socialist May Day parades. He saw how for hours on end, the long rows of workers would march by on their celebrations, seeming to him to be, as he put it, a dragon, nearly a superhuman organism, and this would prefigure some of his attempts to mobilize the German masses on his own. In spite of the personal failure of his attempt in Vienna to become a great artist, forever after, the arts and architecture would remain important to him, but he would seek to place his mark upon the world in politics. What was decisive for Hitler was the experience of the coming of the First World War. It fired Hitler's imagination and gave him a sense of mission that he had not had before. The declaration of war, he later observed, gave him a sense of purpose and belonging. We've described in our earlier lectures the so-called August Madness of 1914, when crowds had celebrated the onslaught of war at last. Well, Hitler was caught up in those crowds in the August Madness in Munich, and indeed, he was captured in a photograph of those days. A photographer who had heard that Hitler had been among the crowds celebrating in Munich the news of the war, years afterwards went back and with a magnifying glass looked through each of the faces in the crowd that he had photographed that day. And indeed, as we can observe in photographs today, Hitler's ecstatic, cheering, shining face was to be found among those crowds. The analyst of crowd behavior, Elias Canetti, whom we've mentioned a few times in our lectures, claimed that this was Hitler's decisive experience, forming him in his later career. This sense of belonging to a larger group, a sense of having a place, was something that Hitler would try to recreate for himself as well as the German people in the future. Shortly after having evaded military service in Austria, Hitler objected to the multinational nature of the Austrian army. Hitler now volunteered for a German regiment, and he served on the Western Front in the trenches and was distinguished with a rare award of an Iron Cross, First Class. In spite of this distinguished military career in ways, Hitler didn't rise through the ranks, and indeed was considered, even by fellow soldiers, to be a little bit odd. Something a little slightly off about this character. In part, his propensity to lecture other soldiers about the greatness of Germany's national cause, the slightly too gung-ho attitude that he evidenced in the trenches. Hitler was sent to a hospital after being caught in a gas attack on the Western Front, and it was there that he would learn that Germany had begged for peace from the Allies. This news struck him like a thunderbolt. He was devastated. He underwent a psychological breakdown, in the course of which, as he later claimed in Mein Kampf, he had had a vision that convinced him that he had a political mission to save Germany and to restore it to its greatness. He would announce that this was the launching of his political career. Hitler, at loose ends, now that peace had come about in 1918, remained in the army, that place where he had found a sense of belonging, even after the armistice. He was hired by the army to observe radical parties in Munich, and in the process of visiting one such party, the German Workers' Party, in September of 1919, he had been spontaneously moved to make a speech and was enrolled as a member, one of about 50 in number at that time, though in order to make their number seem larger, they added several hundred to their party books identifying themselves as party members to give the impression of being a mass movement. By 1921, Hitler had risen dramatically within the movement to become chairman of the party, and members were now calling him the Führer, or the leader, and a nearly religious devotion, a sense of the infallibility, supposedly, of this leader hovered around the figure of Hitler. Hitler renamed the party the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, seeking to appeal across the political spectrum. After the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, Hitler's legal route to power used Weimar democracy and the ballot box to destroy parliamentary government. Growing mass support and intrigue brought Hitler to the chancellorship of Germany in January of 1933. Historians have tried to puzzle out what tantalizing clues we have about Hitler's psychological background and his early youth as well. Such historians are sometimes called by the unfortunate label of psychohistorians, as they aim to understand psychological background. Such psychohistorians have sought to analyze Hitler's childhood, or his upbringing, his education, to account for his later political career. But many of these attempts, tantalizing and intriguing as they can be, are often, in fact, not quite satisfactory, because placing all of our explanatory weight upon the authoritarian childhood or child rearing that Hitler was subject to, and that indeed was common to many in that era, doesn't begin to explain why this man was launched upon a career of political evil, while so many others went on to seemingly normal adulthood. Even the disappointed career goals, obviously alone, cannot explain Hitler. Rather, we see questions of choice as well. The choice to pursue political radicalism, the choice to pursue the route to dictatorship. We turn now to an examination of Hitler as dictator, and we want to point out that there was a method to the madness in Hitler's approach to dictatorship. Hitler's work methods were, even to some of his own followers, maddeningly unsystematic and chaotic. His way of delegating authority often seemed to lack reason or rationale. He would often charge different followers with the same task, duplicating authority. His personal habits were eccentric. He would keep unusual hours. He loved to watch movies late at night. This is perhaps a recurring feature of dictators, and would not keep regular office hours. Historians have referred in particular to Hitler's tactic of duplicating authority giving the same task to different followers and letting them contend to see who could best fulfill that task as bureaucratic Darwinism. And I think that's a very apt name. The notion that the better of the two, the more forceful, the more radical, the more determined would win out, was something that Hitler was putting into practice. Historians have argued over whether this was a deliberate tactic or perhaps unconscious. I feel that there much speaks for it being deliberate and a characteristic mode of operation for Hitler. The outcome of his style of authority was in fact a radicalizing dynamic, a way of operating, a way of setting about dealing with political challenges that favored radical solutions. Because as followers contended to please the Führer, the most radical one could, in many cases, be sure of the Führer's approbation. Nazi followers indeed would sometimes speak of, and the term is significant, working towards the Führer by anticipating his radical beliefs, anticipating his preference for a radical solution. Hitler's often chaotic or unsystematic approach to delegating authority has led some historians to suggest that he was a quote-unquote weak dictator. In fact, however, in matters of ideological importance to Hitler, Hitler always intervened effectively. He could see himself as delegating authority or not dealing with matters that were of less ideological importance to him. In cases that were of importance, such as racial policy, he was sure to be the determining voice. Hitler's dictatorship was also marked by the effectiveness, the aura that was given by a cult of personality, the cult of Hitler as Führer. This was not accidental. This was a carefully cultivated myth of Hitler as the infallible leader of the Third Reich. At first, this cult had grown up around Hitler, perhaps out of the spontaneous devotion of his followers in the early days of the party, but over time it was later deliberately constructed by Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Third Reich. These two men worked in tandem to produce perverse masterpieces of propaganda. The cult of Hitler as a Führer, which Goebbels delighted in and believed as well in a paradox, one often sees this phenomena of ministers of propaganda coming to believe their own propaganda over time, that probably makes it more effective in their presentation of propaganda messages. This propaganda over time also took on quite explicit religious overtones, as did other imagery of the Third Reich. Hitler was hailed as the Messiah, the savior of Germany, using or hijacking earlier religious imagery. The charismatic element that hovered around Hitler and his carefully choreographed and stage-managed appearances could often include an erotic charge for some followers who would be able to project onto this figure of desire. To preserve this erotic charge, Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun, was kept out of sight, and he was presented as an austere, chaste representative of the leadership living for the German people in a mission that transcended such ordinary human concerns. In a bizarre phenomenon, letters flowed into the Chancellery from enthusiastic followers addressed to Hitler. Some of these were embarrassing letters that testified to dreams, in some cases even erotic fantasies about the Führer, and they all testified to the remarkably spontaneous, effective cult of the leader in Germany. There was another remarkable phenomenon that was tied into this cultivation of a cult of personality, and that was the way in which Hitler himself was often isolated or insulated from criticism of the regime's shortcomings. Often the party, the state, even some of Hitler's most senior followers would be blamed by public opinion for this or that shortcoming of the regime, while Hitler himself was considered to be out of the loop, concerned with a big picture, and not to blame for the day-to-day dissatisfactions of Nazi Germany. A recurrent phrase was, "If only Hitler knew." Hitler was remarkably exempted from blame for the failings of the regime until nearly the end of his rule in the Third Reich. What were the keys to Hitler's effectiveness in his rise to power and in his rule over Nazi Germany? Well, there were several. one that we need to keep in mind, first of all, was a persistent pattern of being underestimated. Throughout his rise to power, and even once installed as dictator, Hitler, both at home and abroad, repeatedly benefited from being misunderstood and underestimated. This took place in the international arena as well. Even movies like Charlie Chaplin's fantastic lampoon of Hitler and Mussolini, The Great Dictator, popularized the comic image at odds with Hitler's true menace. And some historians have pointed out that this was perhaps a message that came not at a right time. It was precisely when Hitler needed to be energetically stopped that a picture of a buffoon who was ineffective was being propagated in this otherwise comic classic. In what Hitler considered to be the most perilous, dangerous, risky period for his plans, that's to say the consolidation of his rule and rearmament in Germany in the first years after 1933, he repeatedly claimed that he, as a former soldier, desired nothing more than peace. He hid his true aggressive foreign policy goals for the future. Another key in Hitler's effectiveness was a remarkable ruthlessness. Hitler showed a readiness to use ruthless violence to achieve his ends, beyond merely the bloodthirsty rhetoric so common in his speeches. And early on, this was made especially clear when he massacred some of his own loyal followers, when they seemed to be interfering with his plans. This was made clear on June 30th, 1934, in the so-called Blood Purge. Scores of Hitler's own SA stormtrooper leaders and other targets were murdered by the SS in what came to be called the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler feared that these earlier bully boys, the brown shirts, had done their task, had accomplished their political role of helping him come to power, and now could only be an element for disorder and chaos, a liability for the regime. Thus, he had them executed. In a remarkable tribute, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, on hearing news of the Night of the Long Knives, expressed his admiration for Hitler's character and strength. In secret deliberations of Hitler with his generals and diplomats, such as those recorded in the secret Hossbach Memorandum of 1937, Hitler, while he talked peace in public, was already charting an aggressive foreign policy of rearmament and future conquest. Another key in Hitler's success was being able to rely on security forces of remarkable capacity for terror, in particular the SS. After the purge of the SA in 1934, the SS, Hitler's own protective Schutzstaffel or bodyguard, led by Heinrich Himmler, commenced a dramatic institutional growth. It took on ever larger responsibilities, growing from a small force of bodyguards into a huge empire within an empire, a pillar of the Nazi regime. Heinrich Himmler was in many ways a wan and remarkably pale, unremarkable individual. He was a former failed chicken farmer. He was not a man that seemed remarkable in any way, but he did have a genius for bureaucratic empire building. And under his leadership, the SS, as a Nazi elite, would carve out for itself a special role in executing the racial initiatives of the Third Reich. A final point that was a key to Hitler's effectiveness was the use not only of terror, but also drawing on terror in combination with a remarkable conviction and popularity on the part of the German population at large. One needs to keep in mind that the population was not merely terrorized into obedience, but rather, in many cases, enthusiastically integrated itself into the Nazi vision of society. In the many organizations which the Nazis used to Nazify German society, ordinary Germans found a place. A joke from the period testified to what many ordinary Germans understood as the all-pervasive nature of the Nazification of Germany. In this joke, a little girl in Nazi Germany said that her entire family was very actively involved in the movement. Father was in the stormtroopers, her older brother was in the SS, her smaller brother was in the Hitler Youth, her mother was in the Nazi Women's Organization, and she was in the girls' organization, the League of German Maidens. As the joke continued, the little girl was asked, well, how does your family find time to actually get together as a family? And the little girl answered, oh, that's no problem. They meet at party rallies every year in Nuremberg. Now, this joke was significant not only for revealing the Nazification of German society, it was also significant in that the Nazis themselves might not have objected to this joke. They might have felt that it was a tribute to the thoroughness of their accomplishment in Nazifying German society. Hitler would be able to draw thus not only upon terror, but also upon remarkable popular enthusiasm, especially for his diplomatic revolution. Hitler's foreign policy vision was now one that he tried to put into effect. He envisioned, in private, a new order in Europe and in the world, with Germany holding a dominant position. But in public, he spoke of merely restoring German repute and German standing in the world. Following the ideas of geopolitics that had been articulated in previous decades, Hitler believed that the paramount need for Germany then was increased living space, or Lebensraum, for his reconstituted German master race. In the future order, small nations were to be eliminated. Their day was over. Instead, great consolidated power blocks of superpowers would rule the world. This was Hitler's long-range aim. He now set about it with an innocuous self-image of a man who was asking, he claimed reasonably enough, for a revision of the Versailles Treaty. And Hitler's demands for the revision of the Versailles Treaty, the end of the First World War, were in fact enthusiastically seconded by ordinary Germans, though his aggressive long-range plans were not yet revealed and probably would not have been as popular. Hitler could also count on allies, that is to say, the so-called Axis. His earlier model, now associate, later junior associate, Benito Mussolini in Italy, coined the term Axis in 1936 to describe the new friendship, the new solidarity of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in a new era of changed alignments. Nazi Germany would later sign the Pact of Steel with Italy in 1939. One sees these rhetorical flourishes in international politics. In 1936, then, Hitler also signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, directed against international communism. Hitler could also benefit from the stance of the Western democracies, which was a stance of appeasement. Misunderstanding Hitler and his true intentions, and, understandably enough, determined to avoid a repetition of the horrors and suffering of the World War, the Western democracies sought to meet Nazi Germany's demands insofar as they could be met. Hitler, however, exploited this willingness for compromise by systematically breaking the Versailles Treaty and effecting a diplomatic revolution. He took Germany out of the League of Nations, in which so many hopes for peace had been vested, rearmed Germany in violation of the Versailles Treaty, moved troops into the Rhineland, and annexed Austria, proclaiming that he was bringing it back into the German Reich. When Hitler was prepared to move against Czechoslovakia over the Sudetenland border region, where German minorities were exploited as an issue to provoke a conflict, there took place the Munich Conference in September 29th of 1938, where Britain and France gave in to Hitler's demand for the area without a fight. Hitler had gotten what he wanted without violence. But then, in March of 1939, he occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, making a mockery of the hopes for peace. Appeasement by the Western democracies had been a failure, both in political as well as moral terms. The Western Allies had sold out the sole functioning democracy in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, and they had not managed to take a stand against Hitler when such a stance might truly have brought significant results. Hitler would now also pursue another priority, anti-Semitic programs. Now, these anti-Semitic programs were not merely a new feature on the political landscape of Germany or indeed of Europe. They drew upon a longer European history of anti-Semitism in Western civilization. Centuries of religious anti-Semitism, Christians discriminating against or abusing the minority Jewish populations in Europe, were the background or the context to a growth of a new variety of a virulent radical hatred. This new variety, which built on but also differed in significant ways from earlier religious anti-Semitism, was often called radical racial anti-Semitism or biological anti-Semitism. This ideology, which was racist and social Darwinist, not religious, didn't call for conversion, as had once been the case, but rather separation or elimination of the Jewish minority. The libelous forged so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a clumsy forgery from the 1890s of the Russian Tsarist secret police, claimed that the Jews were organizing a world conspiracy. And in an act of psychological projection, anti-Semites would use such fabricated forgeries as an excuse for mounting an international campaign against what they claimed was an international Jewish threat. The supposedly scientific nature of this new racial or biological anti-Semitism and its far-reaching promises of social integration and of social good, if only this one threat could be eliminated, caused it to be labeled by its critics as socialism for idiots. The notion was that socialism promised social cohesion and unity. Anti-Semites were promising a radical utopia of hatred against the Jews, which they promised, if put into action, could yield goods for society. The Nazis now, however, would set about using the tools of the state to put their hatred into action. Historians continue to debate today about precisely how the Nazi regime reached the destination of genocide, by what route. This question has sometimes been formulated thus: was the road to Auschwitz, to the death camps of Eastern Europe, direct and premeditated and planned out in advance from the first? Or was the road to Auschwitz, as other historians have argued, a twisted path, a road towards destruction which might have taken other turns, one that was not foreordained of necessity? Now, in this debate, there are two schools, the intentionalists and the functionalists. The intentionalists, as they're called, have argued that the Nazis pursued indeed a blueprint for genocide from the outset, that this was implicit from the very earliest articulation of Nazi ideology, and that Hitler pursued, by a clear step-by-step plan, the realization of this genocidal agenda. Other historians who oppose this aspects of this argument are known as functionalists. They're sometimes also called structuralists, who contend that the Nazi regime's functioning or its structure, in fact, did much to set it upon its murderous route. They argue that the functioning of the Nazi regime grew more radical in its policies over time, and that the growing radicalism of these policies eventually would lead to the realization of a program of genocide. Many historians today have recognized that this debate, in fact, perhaps poses false alternatives in too stark, too schematic a form. Many historians today who study these historical events call themselves moderate functionalists and try to, as it were, find a middle ground between the positions. They argue that from the first, the intention was a radical treatment of this group defined as the enemy of the Nazis, but that on the other hand, certainly, those policies could grow ever more radical over time. We can see, indeed, an escalation of Nazi policies against those whom they termed their racial enemies. At first, the Nazis sought to remove the Jewish population from Germany by encouraging emigration. This was not done by means that were legal, but rather through intimidation and violence. In 1935, these policies were ratcheted up further in the infamous Nuremberg laws, which took away the citizenship and the human rights of German Jews and increasingly isolated them socially. The Nazis were adept at prying apart earlier social solidarities and dividing up society. Many ordinary Germans, now barred from interaction with those who had earlier been their German neighbors, might more easily assimilate the demonized stereotypes of the Jews in German society propagated by the Nazis. The next step was a massive act of violence, the so-called Kristallnacht of November 9th, 1938, where in German towns and cities, Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses were attacked, Jews arrested and brutalized. The Nazis now had stepped towards state policies of massive violence against this targeted minority. But there was yet another escalation to come. With the coming of World War II, the Nazis would have cover as well as rhetorical arguments for a further escalation of their policies. Forced emigration would now be replaced with a murderous program of what the Nazis, with their perverse skill for euphemism and perversion of the German language, would call the final solution to their racial utopia, which we'll be examining in our following lectures.